The reduction relief process. So this video I'm going to go over the color reduction relief process. So first off, I'm going to show you setting up your registration jig. So for home printing, something that's really easy and accessible is cardboard. And since I'm using an unmounted linoleum block, it's right around the same thickness of the linoleum, which is great. So I start by tracing out my block in the middle of a piece of cardboard that's larger than my sheet of paper that I'm going to be printing on. And then I'm going to go ahead and slice out that chunk of cardboard where the block goes. So it should be the exact same size as the block that I'm going to be printing. Be careful not to rip the edges. We need a pretty crisp edge so that the block fits in there snug and doesn't wiggle around, so that when we're printing multiple colors, the block's never going to move from that position. So after that, then I need to map out my paper border size. So like I said, this should be larger than my paper. The cardboard should be larger than my paper was. So what I am going to do is, I know my paper size, so I'm going to measure out, first subtract my plate size from my paper size, and then I'm going to measure out where I have kind of even borders all the way around. I am going to leave a little bit of extra room at the bottom usually if I have extra room on my sheet of paper, but I also need to have about an inch at the top for this method because we're going to be using a push pin registration where we're going to be puncturing through the paper, so we have to tear that bit of the paper off afterwards. So I need about an inch at the top that is kind of wasted area on my paper. So right here I've mapped out left and right, and now I'm mapping out top and bottom. And then, like I said, I need a little bit of extra room for where my push pins are going to be. So I'm going to measure down about an inch here and map out where I'm going to be punching into the paper. So I'm going to double check and make sure that my paper actually fits in this space and that I map this out correctly. And you can see now I'm going to be setting up that push pin registration. So I'm going to measure down about half an inch or an inch here from the top of the paper. Here I'm doing half an inch. And then I'm going to mark out that line. And this is where I'm going to put down some tape. So I want to reinforce the holes, very similar to how you'd like reinforce some binder clip holes if you ever did that. So I put down the tape so that when I push into the cardboard with the push pins, the tape will kind of reinforce the holes where the cardboard probably wants to kind of crumble and wiggle a little bit. If I put down a couple pieces of tape where I push through, it should keep it so that that hole stays intact in the shape and size that it is. And so once I've got that done, you can see I have these little pieces of tape down below. Those are going to actually go onto my sheets of printing paper. So I'm going to take little pieces of that tape and I'm going to space them out so that I have two holes on my printing paper. I don't want them to be right next to each other or way too far apart. So it's about a quarter of the way in on each side. So this will be giving me a good spot to keep the paper nice and tight and secured in place. I'm going to push through those push pins through those pieces of tape. And now I'm going to use that guide of where those push pins are to put down my next pieces of tape on each individual sheet of paper. And then I'm going to push through using my original sheet through those sheets of paper by lining them up and then pushing through into the cardboard. Don't push into a solid surface or you're going to ruin your push pins. And do that with each sheet of paper for however many sheets I have in my edition. So if I had 6, I'd push through 6. If I had 20, I'd push through 20. Using those same original holes as my guide, I'm circling them on my cardboard, and you can see that sheet goes in there. push pins fall into the hole, and then I do the same thing as I'm printing. Each one would line up in the same spot every single time, and it just makes sure that when I'm doing different color layers that they're going to line up in the same way. So here I'm showing how I planned out these layers. So you always print light to dark. So I'm taking a photo and I'm translating that into a print just because it's the easiest to see. So I'm going to simplify the colors down to a 4-color print. So I'd start with the white, which I carve out first, and then my first color would be that cream color. Second color would be the sky. Third, the red. Fourth, the black lines and the sign. So for this here, what I'm going to do is I'm once again looking at my guide, kind of mapping out colors, and on this sheet I actually see the sky as the lightest bit. So I'm going to decide that the sky is actually going to be my first color that I print. And so this is a reduction process. So like I said, printing light to dark. A darker color will cover up a lighter color, but a lighter color will not cover up a darker color. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is carve out anything that I want to stay completely white. So this would be pure white because I'm printing on white paper. It's the paper that's going to be showing through. So I'm not actually printing a white. It's just that no ink will be going on those areas. So that will be the white of the paper, and it will act as the white in my image. So I'm going to go through carving all those areas out, which isn't a ton in this image. It's mostly there's some white around the letters on the sign, and then some little highlights on that tan building that I'm looking at, and some other little random highlights throughout just to give a little bit of variation on the print. So I want to make sure all the little chunks of ink or chunks of linoleum are gone, and then I can go ahead and print my first color. So I've already mixed up all my colors. I'm pointing out that what I'm going to print first is this sky. So I've got my registration guide. What I'm doing right now is I'm pushing down the cardboard, like smashing it down so that it is lower than my block, because when I'm pushing down with this block that I'm going to be using to apply pressure to my plate to transfer the ink, if the cardboard's up higher, it's going to prevent me from getting good pressure on the block. So I've got my bluish gray colored ink, which is going to be my sky. The thing is, it's going to print on everything other than that area that I carved out white. So all the same principles apply for rolling out ink here. So I want a nice even slab. I don't want to overcoat it. So once again, skin of a peach is what I'm looking for when it's on the slab, a slight hiss. And so I'm going to roll this out, even it out, pull my block out of my registration jig because I don't want to get ink all over that. I'm putting this on a piece of paper so I don't get it on my cutting mat here either. So inking it up, it should have that same peach skin look. Remember, the first time you ink this up, it's always going to suck up a little more ink than once it's inked up and you're printing your second or third print. So now I can put it in my jig. I put my push pins through my punched holes, and then I'm gonna put those push pins into the holes on the registration jig. Make sure the paper is down nice and secure, and then I'm gonna put a couple pieces of tape, just because the cardboard's a little bit flimsy, to make sure that this doesn't move around on me while I'm applying pressure. So then all the same things apply with the printing. Because I'm using that Eastern paper, I can see the areas where the ink is coming through, and I can tell mostly if I have a pretty well inked and well transferred image. So you can see me checking on occasion to make sure it's done. I can pull that back, it looks nice and even. I can take the push pins out. Be careful not to pull on that or yank on that, because it can expand your holes and then your next image won't line up. And then pull the plate out of the jig, re-ink, put it back in the jig, and go through the same process of pins in paper, pins into the cardboard jig, and then print. It is important, like I said, that you don't expand the holes on your jig or expand the holes on your paper too much, because it can make it so that your next color won't line up. After I've printed my first color on all my sheets of paper, depending on how big my edition is, then typically you can print a couple colors on your first day, but usually you want to let your ink dry for at least 24 hours before you print your next color. And this will depend on the sort of ink that you're using and the kind of humidity of wherever you're at. But you should give it at least 24 hours so that the next ink layer will actually sit on top well. So here I'm going to clean up in between, and then next I would carve out the areas that I want to keep the first color. So my first color was that blue sky. So now I want to remove all the bits of linoleum from the plate that I want to stay that color. So the first color, right, we removed the white because we wanted the white of the paper to come through. Now we remove the areas that had been printed that we want to stay a specific, the color that we just printed. Because when we ink this up again, we want to cover up the areas that are going to be our next color, but we don't want that cream color, which is our next color, to go where the sky was. So carving through, you can see I'm taking out a pretty big area here. That sky takes up a pretty big chunk of the plate. The only thing I'm leaving in the sky are those telephone wires, which will catch every color up until the last color. Notice I'm always carving away from my hand. And I've got two linoleum tools just because I've got one that has a small bit and one that has a large bit. So one for the details and one for the large areas. So now I can go ahead and print my next color. So it's going to be this cream color. I'm taking out a little, there's a couple little marks that I forgot to pull out, so I'm just pulling those out right before I print. Once again, evening out the slab, make sure I have that peach skin ink up the whole plate. Outside of the jig, the registration jig, put it into the jig. Pins and paper, pins and cardboard, plate down, tape, paper down, and then apply the pressure until I have a good transfer. Remember, you can pull up the paper on occasion just to look, but you don't want to pull it all the way off. You kind of peel up the corner like I just did there. See what you got, and if once it's even, pull it up. So now you can see that the blue maintained where it was, and now I have that cream color everywhere else. Remember, when you're printing colors and you're layering colors on top of each other, that you have to consider the fact that the color underneath will affect the color you put on top a little bit. So you have to adjust your colors based off of that. So the blue underneath that cream is going to affect the cream, make it a little bit darker. So now I need to carve out the areas that I want to stay cream. So I've already removed the sky, and now it's time to remove the building other than those letters. And then, so I'll be leaving behind the letters, that street sign, any of these kind of outlines that I have on the building, as well as those telephone wires. And so once I've done that, now I'm moving on to that red. You can see that the red I have is a little bit lighter than what you see in the image. You don't have to print the exact same colors that are in an image, right? You can choose whichever colors you want. But because I have that tan underneath, I'm printing a slightly lighter red because when it sits on top of that tan, it's going to go a little bit darker. So once again, back through this same process, you can see there's much less on the block now. It's really only those letters and those signs that are getting that. So inked up out of the jig, back in the jig, pens and paper, pins in to the cardboard, tape down so that the paper doesn't move, and pressure. You can see the red kind of coming through the image here. Like I said, it helps you really to see what you've applied enough pressure to and what maybe needs a little bit more. That's the benefit of that Eastern paper. So I'm peeling back. If it looks good, I can pull it off. So you can see how this image is coming together pretty quickly. I did all this printing in a day, but like I said, you'd want to let this stuff dry for a little bit. So now I would need to carve out everything other than the black or the key of my image. So whatever your darkest color is. So now I'm getting rid of all the red in this image and leaving only those really dark bits that are left behind. We call it the key because it kind of ties all this stuff together. And so really there's not going to be much left of my block at the end of this. And you can even see when I ink this up with the black, there's not much there. It's really just some tiny lines. And once again, I had to take a little chunk out that I had forgotten to pull away. All the same process. Pressure again, and this should tie everything together. The thing, like I said, you need to make sure that you're not stretching out those holes so that all this lines up really well, really close together. And so there are my images, complete and finish, 4 colors. After these dry, I would tear off the tape and that edge of my paper and sign and title my print.